Well, good evening. I'm Pete Peterson, Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here to Pepperdine's West LA campus for what I know is going to be a provocative conversation about something that's so important, which is essentially the state of higher education and the importance of the liberal arts. As many of you may know, what makes the School of Public Policy so unique as a graduate program is that we focus on the liberal arts. We certainly do balance the quantitative aspects of policy analysis with study of the great ideas, history, political philosophy. And we do that because our founder, the late great political scientist James Q. Wilson, understood that when you're dealing with public policy, you're dealing with policy, but you're also dealing with the public. And if you don't have a good understanding of humanity and who you're dealing with, chances are you don't know yourself very well. But you also don't know the public with whom you're working with. Public policy is not something that's formed in a test tube. That the reaction that you get to housing policy in West Los Angeles is not what you're going to get in Dallas, Texas, is not what you're going to get in Baghdad, Iraq. And our 900 alums now serve all over the world in a variety of different positions in government and in nonprofits and in business. And if anything they take away from their 2 years with us is this understanding that you are dealing with a public that lives in a particular time and in a particular place. And to teach that most effectively, we've believed for 2 decades that a good liberal arts education blended and mixed with a solid quantitative policy analysis set of courses is the best way to prepare public leaders. And that's why it's a real honor and pleasure to welcome Dr. Margarita Mooney here. As a way of framing her talk this early evening, Dr. Mooney was good enough to send me along a piece that she's written recently in Public Discourse. And I just wanted to quote one paragraph that I thought was really so significant and will help frame the rest of our conversation. She writes, "My experience as a student and professor has helped me understand how important philosophical anthropology, our understanding of the nature of the human person, is to developing a pedagogical approach to learning, especially in our current moment of cultural and political fragmentation. Faulty anthropologies will lead us astray, but a sound philosophical anthropology, understanding our essence as humans, made to know, love, and serve others and God, can help us get person-centered education right." How do we get person-centered education right? How do we get person-centered public policy right? Well, I think as we'll learn this evening, we get it through a truer understanding of the great ideas and how they connect us not only to each other but also to God. And with that, again, I'm so honored to welcome Margarita Mooney. Dr. Mooney is the associate professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. She got her bachelor's in psychology at Yale and her PhD in sociology at Princeton. She teaches the philosophy of social science as well as religion and social theory and several other courses at Princeton SEM. In 2016, and I know she's going to be talking to us a little bit about this, she launched something called the Scala Foundation, which is essentially a liberal arts intensive study program led around the world as a way of engaging, by and large, undergraduate and young professionals in a study of the liberal arts and its application to everyday life. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Margarita Mooney.
Thank you. It's a really great pleasure to be here with you tonight to discuss this very important question about whether or not a liberal arts education can survive in the burnout culture. But I wanted to begin by sharing with you a little bit about some events that got me to care about this question. From 2013 to 2016, I was on the faculty of sociology at Yale University, my undergraduate alma mater, when some racial protests broke out in the fall of 2015. I was also a faculty resident fellow of one of the undergraduate colleges for students, the one actually named for John C. Calhoun, a proponent of slavery. So my apartment here, this is one of the protests that occurred on campus. And my apartment is really right here on the 3rd floor of this building. So for the entire fall, I was geographically as well as symbolically in the middle of these student protests about the history of racism at Yale and racial issues in the US. I was also an eyewitness to some of the student confrontations with faculty who defended free speech on campus. This photograph here may look familiar to some of you. It made the news a lot because there was a rather uncivil, unfriendly confrontation between students and Professor Nicholas Christakis, who defended free speech on campus. He ultimately ended up resigning from his position in student life, keeping his faculty position. But I had attended as well, the day after this confrontation, I attended an event about free speech at Yale, the history of free speech at Yale and the future of it. And students became very angry at a comment made by Greg Lukianoff from the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and somewhat ironically used their rights to free speech to try to shut down an event talking about free speech. And I was rather wondering about some of these issues, but at the same time, as this was going on, because as I mentioned, I was on the faculty but living with undergraduates for the first time, I began running reading groups in my apartment in Calhoun. And the first one I did, I called it the Calhoun Happiness Project. Well, it turns out what students wanted to talk about was stress and anxiety and depression. And as a faculty member, I had been a little removed from student life, and I don't think it was until I was living with students and interacting with them every day and having them over to my apartment and discussing great books with them just around my living room that I came to see just how severe the student mental illness crisis was. And this picture in the middle is me acting a little goofy with students at my going away party at the end of my 3 years living in Calhoun College. And what I'm here to share with you tonight is how, in the midst of this pretty chaotic time at Yale, both because of the student protests as well as because of the mental illness issues, somehow I was able to create a community of learning and hospitality in the midst of a rather tumultuous time at Yale. And I've spent the last few years reflecting on my views of what am I actually doing in education as a professor? What are my responsibilities for teaching and mentoring? And I want to share with you why I actually think that both some of the student protests as well as the student mental illness crisis have something to do with the university moving away from its core mission to defend and teach the pursuit of truth and to teach students to know and love the truth. And I really have come to think that universities standing behind the pursuit of truth as their mission is a very much a necessary bulwark against ideological thinking that can squash human freedom. But I also think that universities standing behind their mission as the pursuit of truth is an indirect way to respond to the burnout culture. And what I have found in doing these seminars, which now I'll tell you a little bit more about, is that one of the things that students have found that's resonated most with them is that as human beings, we really desire to know the truth and to love the truth. Now, let me just show you, when I left when I left Yale and moved to Princeton, I decided that these issues were really important and I wanted to keep teaching students and discussing these ideas with students. So I founded Scala Foundation. I got the word Scala I actually got it from the Rule of St. Benedict, chapter 7, when Benedict talks about the ladder. Scala is a Latin word for ladder. And he uses the image of the ladder to describe how as human beings we both ascend to excellence while descending in humility. And I thought this need to balance excellence with humility was very apropos for today's students who are very achievement-oriented. And also the image of the ladder talks about the need to balance body and soul, right? So again, kind of this need for integration of the whole person. And my dream when I founded Scala was to do a seminar where we would discuss the mission of the university and the purpose of liberal arts education, but also live what it was we were talking. Because one of the challenges of education is that some of the most important things we want people to learn can't be taught. Maybe they can be modeled, they can be lived, they can be experienced, but not everything can be taught. So I put together a curriculum on the mission of the university, the history of debates around philosophical anthropology, the death of the transcendent in modernity, and what all this means for the crisis of higher education, issues around technology and young people, the mental health crisis. and put all of these topics together and took 14 students from different universities across the US to the UK for 2 days. Sorry, 2 weeks. And what I'm going to show you now is a clip from a video of the second time that I did this trip. I've done this trip 2 times. I'll be doing it again in 2019, though at a location in the US. And as a matter of fact, the video that you're going to watch was produced by a graduate of Pepperdine who is now working in public policy and communications in DC. You will see some footage from the seminar of the activities we did, as well as my teaching, and a little interview from me, and then there'll be an interview from one of the students who participated, who, by the way, is also a Pepperdine graduate, undergraduate, who was in the Great Books program, got a master's in education from Harvard, is now teaching Latino students in California, and is going to get a PhD in education and psychology. So let me show you the video to show kind of the summer program which I put together.
My name is Dr. Margarita Mooney. I'm the founder of Scala Foundation. I started the Scala Summer Seminar because I wanted to create a platform for students to engage with questions that they might not encounter in the classroom, but that are central to education. So we study the meaning of a classical liberal arts education. We read debates about integrating faith and reason across different fields of knowledge. We read about contemporary debates in culture and politics that affect institutes of higher education. And we talk about how all different fields of knowledge contribute to understanding the human experience. And the choice of locations is really important. We begin in Oxford, which is like Las Vegas for academics, because not only do we read authors like John Henry Newman and C.S. Lewis, we actually see where they lived and worked. And we experience these educations of higher learning that were built more than 1,000 years ago to preserve knowledge from the classical age and pass it on to future generations. Then we go to Ampleforth in the north of England, in a rural setting, where we continue to have 3 seminars a day, but during our free time we take walks in nature and we visit local historical sites. So the conversations we have during our seminar time carry over into all of our free time. So all of this contributes to the main goal of Scala, which is to generate a personal transformation, so that when students return to their studies and to their professions, they bring back with them the ideas and the texts and the questions that we share together in England, and continue those conversations, bringing new people into this important dialogue.
I really connected with my traditionalists and religious congregants for the reason that they all address the question advocated right now, which is how do we look at exposing students to ideas that are uncomfortable associated with big questions that have to do with who we are as people. And these authors spoke to, one, the need to move people through the change process, but also identify the resistances to the change.
It's so many good readings, but I think if I'm to zero in on one, it would be
Okay, so having now shown you a video clip of what we do in the summer seminar, I've taken a step back to sort of think about what is it about this model that has been so transformative for students. And so one component, or one sort of principle that guides what I do in Scala, is that I think it's important to be able to talk about tradition in education. And by tradition, again, as I mentioned earlier, there are debates about education often focus on the content. What should be taught? And should we have a core curriculum in higher ed? And what does that look like? And I try to broaden that a little bit by at least introducing students to the idea that I've really come to see that every institute of education stands in some particular tradition. And it's better to acknowledge that than to say that we're starting from nowhere or we're simply providing a skill set. But I think of tradition more like a backpack. Oftentimes when people, especially youth, hear the word tradition, there's almost this reaction against it. But I think of tradition like you're carrying a backpack that's full of ideas and you need to unpack it and be able to put it out on the table so that you can examine it. But tradition, alongside an emphasis on human freedom, always means that in education there's possibilities for expanding, for building upon the tradition that's being handed down to you, for bringing in new voices. Tradition by no means means that knowledge is somehow static and we're only looking backwards at the past. But tradition it's like a starting point that, along with human freedom, can help students understand where they're even beginning from as they approach their education. I think, as you could see in the video, I use a mix of Socratic and experiential methods in the classroom. I find that with today's younger generations, especially iGen and the sort of hyper-tech students, and also students who are sometimes afraid to express their viewpoints because of what other people might think, it's really important for the teacher to be in the classroom and to get students to really elicit their participation at a deep level. So I begin the seminars with a set of guiding questions, but I really try to encourage a high level of participation where students are working through a text together. The idea is that we're coming together in the classroom to understand the text and come to a deeper knowledge by everybody sharing and discussing, and at times disagreeing. And as you heard in the testimony, one of the important things we need to model for students today is a classroom environment where differences of viewpoint can be expressed, but again, with the pursuit of truth as the objective, right? That we need to be able to express our viewpoints so we can come to a better understanding of the truth. And that, the experiential methods of teaching, so by that what I mean is that the conversations that I try to stimulate, I want them to continue over students' free time. Students so often will leave the classroom and the first thing they do is turn on one of their devices or text somebody, but part of what, there should be more of an organic nature between what students are doing in the classroom and what they're doing with their friends outside of the classroom. So when I designed the summer seminar, I sort of had all the conditions that I could set up our free time to be what St. Augustine would call otium, leisure that lifts the mind and heart to God. And I found that when I set up these leisure activities for students, walks in nature, visits to art museums, it would lift their heart and their mind so that then when they come back into the classroom, they're bringing their whole person to the topic. And it's a counter to this kind of fragmentation where what students are doing in their free time feels so disjointed from what they're doing in the classroom. And the final element that I think is extremely important in today's context is the need for hospitality grounded in charity. I've seen so much division in higher ed, and I've seen so much mental illness, that all the activities that I try to do, I really try to lead with a strong sense of hospitality and charity, which means welcoming people who are very different from you and loving them, but loving them in the mission of education, which is the pursuit of truth. Loving someone does not always mean agreeing with them. It doesn't have to mean affirming them, but it should mean treating them as a person with dignity and with freedom, even when you disagree. And this is something that students really need to see modeled and learn to practice. So another way of saying it, a briefer way of saying it, is I feel like the four kind of fundamental elements of what I'm trying to do in Scala is combine sort of a content where students are being proposed a set of ideas, creating a context where the student experiences integration and can engage the content as a whole person, to bring a pedagogy that's responsive to this particular generation and their challenges, and to build community around learning. And so, I will say, like, the 2 times I've done the seminar in the UK and come back, I've sort of been like in this, wondering if this is just some sort of a utopia, that my vision for how we can do education is just some sort of a dream. But I just thought I'd kind of show you this picture, like this is Monte Cassino, which is one of the first monasteries founded by St. Benedict, and well, here's Pepperdine in Malibu, sitting on top of a cliff. And what I realized was that what some people might think sounds like a utopia, the kind of experiences that I've created through Scala, in some ways, I'm pointing the university back to what its original mission was. And I don't think it's incidental that a great university like Pepperdine is on top of a cliff. Monasteries are put on top of a cliff, not just for protection, that might have been part of it, but because symbolically, the process of education, this dynamic, evolving process, kind of like, imagine if you were scaling the rocks to go up Pepperdine, like forget the stairs, scaling the rocks, right? And it's an arduous journey, right? Understanding the world, coming to experience reality and know reality from a variety of perspectives. It's a tough journey. And you have a teacher, maybe you have a harness, but your harness is the teacher who's kind of guiding you up, but you as a student have to take that next step on your own, and you have to keep climbing. And when you get to the top, it's not that reality has changed, but your perspective has changed. And now from the bottom of the cliff in Malibu to the top, you're seeing the same thing, but you're seeing it in more depth and more beauty and more glory. And this is what students are desiring in education. Not only to be passed on content, as important as it is, but to have their entire worldview and their perspective on reality deepened and strengthened and inspired once again. So again, when I take students, I've started taking students to monasteries in the UK and the US, and in some ways it's not that I'm trying to put us back into the Middle Ages, but I'm simply trying to point out that the system of higher education as we know it grows out of this particular kind of tradition. And understanding what their vision was and adapting it to our circumstances is part of what we should be doing in education. And there's something to be learned from this older model. Now, how that translates into the present is going to look different in a variety of places, but so many students don't even know where the university came from. So again, here's some images of the types of activities that I've done with students which try to live out this model of education. Several of them are from our trips to the UK. Here we are in Oxford, here we are at Rievaulx Abbey, and here we are, I believe that's Castle Howard. But when I'm back in Princeton, I've started inviting students over to my apartment, to my house in Princeton quite often. Sometimes I will have an outside speaker just come to my living room and meet with students for 20, 30, 40 minutes of a lecture and followed by dinner. We move over to, this is my kitchen table. It seats, 6 comfortably, 10, and you smash them together. I have a giant dining room table that I can seat, comfortably 12, but I've had up to 16. So I will very often have between 20 and 25 students for dinner with a faculty member from Princeton or elsewhere. And I find that for students, having this kind of intimate setting allows them to, again, engage the topic that they're learning about and pose these kind of big questions. So now I'm starting, now that I've done this seminar for a few summers in the UK and I've been running all these activities in Princeton, I've drawn students from different parts of the country to the summer seminars, and I've started going back and visiting the campuses where the students have come from. And I've started networking, meeting with colleagues of mine in the broader New York area, Columbia, UPenn, Yale, because this moment that we're living in higher education, the issues I'm talking about are affecting every institute. Now, I'm focusing on higher education. There is a connection here to K-12 education, to what's going on in K-12, and that's come up a lot. Many of the graduates of my seminar have gone into teaching high school education and are really committed to bringing a liberal arts approach to education to the high school level and to underprivileged students, to minority students. But keeping them connected in a network of institutes of higher education that can prepare them to do this is one of my goals. I've gone a little bit further afield talking about Scala's mission, been down to Baylor and UT Austin seminar or any of the other seminars that I've led. Some of them might go into education. Their goal might be to be a teacher at K-12 or higher ed. And then they'll take this model, hopefully, into their own educational environments. Others are going to go into research and scholarship, but many are going to go into a profession. So what's the connection then between a liberal arts education and working for the common good and a sense of purpose? If liberal arts education isn't primarily about utilitarian ends or credentials, helping students discover what their passion is and how they're going to use their knowledge in a particular field is something that does take time. So this is where I am now, sort of thinking through how to continue building on the experiences that I've had and the successful programs that I've run. Always keeping in mind that what I'm really aiming for is a transformation of how students see themselves and how they understand education. So I'll just end with a couple of quotes from students who've been on the different activities that I've done, and I think that these quotes really, this one in particular here, it really is the antithesis of the burnout culture. When someone can experience an authentic intellectual and spiritual community where you experience friendship, curiosity, openness, and zest for life, that to me sounds like a really great mission of education, and it's indirectly responding to the burnout culture and doing it in an environment of freedom and charity. This is what students are so longing for. This student here has not participated in the summer seminar, but he's been to many dinner seminars at my house and many of the weekend trips. And I think his quote expresses this kind of dynamism of education, that by combining the content with the experiential education, it's forced him to sort of reread and restructure his life in light of his intellectual formation. And then that gives rise to new academic questions that he brings back. So how to continue this process and how to broaden it is a discussion I would love to have with you. And I'll just leave up some of the books that I have students read in the seminars, which are books that I'm happy to teach in smaller groups or give recommendations for how to run seminars on these books. Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and to talking about liberal arts in the burnout culture with you. Yes?
Yeah, and that was fascinating. Thank you for your commitment to education. It's very exciting to listen to. Could you say something about how when you say burnout culture, could you define what you mean by that?
That's a great question. I use that term to describe the sense that I get from students that their worth is constantly being measured against some yardstick of another line on the CV or another test score, combined with a loss of purpose or meaning. And so even very high-functioning, successful students often kind of can't tell you why they're doing any of this. And at some point, that turns into just not wanting to go through that next step, not wanting to make that next move. And the burnout, I think, it can express itself as a kind of severe mental illness, but it can also just express itself as a kind of sense of loss of interiority of the person and simply seeing oneself as a cog in a machine that needs to make the next step. And then students oftentimes have told me that part of the impact of this is that they actually have a hard time experiencing joy or happiness. They're never quite in a state of kind of contemplative relaxation or depth.
Don't you think they're correct in some way? I mean, the process of getting into college has changed so much. And it's very much, this is my take on it, a very extractive process rather than a meaning-making process. and it's very monetized. I mean, it depends on the institution, of course, but it seems that we're producing products often, and the kids are missing this element of community connection, integration, which is what it sounds like you're healing. It sounds like you're healing, that.
And I think part of what I'm trying to do is help people to see the connection between the way that we do on education and the way that we understand who a human person is. And as a way of example, in one seminar I taught, I was teaching a book by Alistair McIntyre called After Virtue, and I gave a short lecture on it. And one student came up to me after class, and she asked me, she said, "You said something about unconditional love. Can you tell me what that is, and how do you get it if you've never had it?" I was astounded, but I realized that she was expressing something that a lot of students feel, that implicitly or explicitly, she had always been told that her worth as a person rests in some kind of achievement. And she was a high achiever. She was a Yale student. But she didn't know why her life mattered. And she literally said that she wasn't sure her life did matter. So my answer to her was that, and again, one thing I've learned with this generation, I draw on personal experiences. And I said, well, when I was in Haiti, I thought that because I was coming from the United States and had an Ivy League degree and maybe some money, that I could do something to help people. And I realized that maybe my skills and my money was going to help them meet some need, but they didn't really want the things that I had. They wanted to know me as a person. And if I didn't love them for who they are and look down on them for not having what I had, then they didn't want to touch the things that I was bringing. So I encouraged her to find an environment where she was not going to be measured by the strength of her intelligence or her ability to succeed in something. And so she actually went out, and I just encouraged her to do something, I don't know what, and she went out and found a theater group for children, and she started doing children's theater. And she experienced something like people wanting her to be there just because they enjoyed being with her. And when that kind of healing of her self-image, it took a lot of time, but she's now applying to be a public school teacher in her hometown. But she needed a way to connect with this deeper part of who she is. And so many students have never had that opportunity. Yes?
Yeah. So I'm a second-year EVOL student here at Pepperdine University. Last semester, I took a class one of the classes was in curriculum design. Our professor was Dr. Mark Allen, excellent professor. I learned a lot. So during my research in one of the presentations, I was looking at the cost of education in online education, schools that are popping up. So I looked at some courses in udemy.com and edX, and I was not able to find, as part of my research I was doing, I said, okay, people who are not able to afford, like Pepperdine and Yale and the Princeton, all those, many of them are taking those classes just so they can build the skills so they can get a job and all that kind of stuff. I was not able to find a whole lot of liberal arts type courses. So one of my questions during my presentation that I posed to the class, we didn't get a chance to have a discussion about it because time was up, is without those education in liberal art type education, how, we were talking about leadership also, where would the knowledge of emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and all those, where would that come in? And would we be able to work in a collaborative environment if we're not able to communicate effectively because we don't have the level of knowledge that is required that is taught in liberal arts? So I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit with all these online education and skill-focused education.
if I hear your question correctly, sort of what's going to happen if a lot of people don't have access to liberal arts education? How will they develop the kind of emotional intelligence and communication, teamwork? Well, I would say two things. I would say that liberal arts education indirectly contributes to emotional intelligence and team building, but it contributes to it by helping people to understand and perceive reality, to look at things from a variety of perspectives, to engage with differences, to engage people who are different than them. And I would say that in that sense, liberal arts education contributes to that goal of emotional intelligence and communication and team building as a secondary effect of the pursuit of truth and the development of the whole person. Sometimes there can be a tendency to identify a need that people have and then go write a curriculum for it. So let's write a curriculum for emotional intelligence, let's write a curriculum for team building. There's some value in that. But things like emotional intelligence and teamwork and communication are not always things that can be turned into a curriculum with a test at the end. That may not be the best way to do it. And to assume that certain types of education, again, this is where I think sometimes liberal arts education gets conflated with other things, right? I think a well-done liberal arts education produces a person who's capable of becoming moral and virtuous and a good citizen and a good team builder, but it's not the same thing as kind of a curriculum for virtue, right? And this is a different way that the term gets used. And when you read debates about liberal arts education, this is one of the big debates, right? Reading the great books isn't going to make you a moral person. It might give you a conceptual framework and a grammar that's going to help you make the right choices. But you still have freedom, and you still have free will, and you still have temptation to do the wrong things. So there's plenty of people who've read great books and gone through a liberal arts education who aren't good, upright, moral people. So one of the temptations of education that Jacques Maritain and many others have warned against is education trying to do too much. And when education becomes about responding to every missing part of the person, that's not exactly what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that liberal arts education and an understanding of tradition of the whole person should shape education, but not try to control all of the different elements of the person that are also being shaped in the home. They're being shaped in church, they're being shaped in civil society, they're being shaped by politics. So the person is a part of culture and they're part of all kinds of things. And so I think what sometimes can happen in education is because we care, as educators, we care about the whole person. That doesn't mean that the mission of education is to fix every psychological problem or to provide the right kind of workers for the economy or to heal our political divide. All of that, I think, is a secondary effect of education doing its core mission well. Yes?
Hi, thanks for giving your talk. It was very interesting. I'd like to start by saying I'm a first year, my gosh, I wish, at Pepperdine's policy school, but I went to undergrad at Cal Poly SLO, which is a large polytechnic state university. We had like 20,000 kids there. We're focused on engineering. How would you see something like this being enacted in a place where, one, the professors have multiple hundreds of students, so they don't have the opportunity to have a seminar in their home, or where the professors themselves are not necessarily liberal arts minded? So how do you approach a situation like that where everyone's geared toward science and math and producing? How do you see liberal arts fostering in environments where STEM dominates everything?
Okay, so those are sort of three, I think, related questions. To what extent can a liberal arts model be scaled when the classroom is really big? And I think that applies whether it's STEM or not STEM. And then a kind of related question is, well, what does a liberal arts model of education look like for STEM-focused centers of education? But I also heard sort of a third question, which is, how do you do this model of education when faculty themselves may not even be interested? They may not think that this is their role to do this. So a couple of things. I have taught at a large state school, and the size of the classes does matter for the ability to have the kind of interaction with the students and the professors that I talked about. But there are ways, and in some ways the state school that I taught at was almost more concerned about pedagogy than the Ivy Leagues because they had to. So there are ways, and of course you can't have the professor interacting personally with students, but even in large classes, you can break up lecture times with small group exercises. And I've done that, and I've done that quite successfully. And I think a skilled educator knows how to take their topic and write exercises that's going to get students to talk to each other a little bit about what they're learning, to think about how they're going to apply it. And on a practical level, you know, when I was in the state school, I tried to be realistic about the context that I was in and just do a few steps bigger, right? And then you get students themselves excited about this. So I think more needs to be worked out there, but you're right that the vast majority of students who go into higher education are not sitting around a seminar with 12 people and the professor having all these great conversations. That said, large classrooms are not inimical to interaction. Science and engineering is a huge push across all the major universities that I know. And there is a small, but I'd say small but growing group of professors of science and engineering who really do see the importance of connecting the humanities to science and engineering. Because again, this is one of the things that I hit on in the Scala Summer Seminar, where I do have science majors and neuroscience, people going into medicine. The purpose of science and engineering, the purpose of the knowledge produced by science and engineering is what? It's to serve the human person. And if you develop science and engineering and you're never exposing people to the foundational questions of who are we as human beings, then how do they know to what end their science or their knowledge is going to be, is supposed to be used? And I also have students read in the summer seminar that we've kind of almost accepted this idea that science is about deductive reasoning rather than creativity or intuition or beauty, right? Science, math, engineering, those are ways of shaping and forming the human mind, but we're still a person. So I am working with an engineer at Princeton on civil engineering, and part of her passion is to help students to understand the importance of beauty in civil engineering. So should bridges be functional? Yeah, I want my bridge to be a bridge and I want it to work. But look at the bridges that we build. They're beautiful. And that tells us something about who we are as humans. And so science and engineering needs the humanities to even pose the question, to what ends is their science and engineering going to be used? And all of the philosophers of education that I talk about were acutely aware of this. Acutely aware of this. They were responding in many ways to Nazi education, which was both about propaganda, but it was also about using the knowledge produced by science to create dominance of one group of people over another. And it's hard to stop our knowledge in science and engineering from being used for the wrong reasons if we're not producing scientists and engineers who can pose these basic questions about humanity. So in a couple of weeks, I'm having a neuroscientist from Stanford come to my house, and he's going to speak about gene editing. We have some pretty amazing technologies that could fundamentally alter who we are as human beings. Is that a good thing? Is that a good thing? Is it always a good thing to use all of our technological power to do anything we want with the human person and the human body? And one thing I want to get across to students, which I think most science and engineers, frankly, they need to catch up with philosophy of science. They are not the master of all forms of knowledge. This is part of the problem in education, is that we have elevated one form of knowing above all other forms. Empirical methods of science cannot answer the question, does the human person have a consciousness? Cannot tell you if the human person has a soul. But yet how they use their knowledge really depends on how you think about that question. And if you don't believe the human person has a soul, I'm not really sure where you get the idea that the human person isn't merely a tool to be used by one group of people. Why not? Look at history. Look at the history of movements that didn't believe that the human person has something inviolable and dignified about them, that were purely material beings. Where does that lead us? Not down a good path.
We have time for one more question.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I've observed the tendency that people say, well, kids are just grinding away, trying to be high achievers because people are saying, we expect you should do that. Just to be a high achiever, make me look good as a parent or something like that. But how does what you've been describing here, the motivation students have, relate to the idea of to whom much is given, much is expected? As a motivator.
Which is the motto of Pepperdine, by the way.
Excuse me?
Which is the motto of Pepperdine.
No kidding.
So I'm at the university where to whom much is given, much is to be expected. I mean, I think the parable of the talents is very telling. Clearly, everybody has a set of talents, and some people are talented in some ways, and others are talented in other ways. I think with talents comes responsibilities. But again, I think that needs to be linked back to a sense of what I would say a vocation and a calling. And I think for someone to be talented in mathematics, they may really want to become an artist, right? So knowing what you're good at and knowing what you're called to be in the world, I don't think are exactly the same thing. And part of what I think has happened in our culture that I see often with young people, if you're good at something, okay, just do that, right? If you're good at science, just do science. So you can do a lot of science classes, you can get out as an engineer, and you're gonna make a lot of money when you get out, right? But just because you're good at something doesn't mean your mind isn't also developed by trying things that you're not so good at, right? So going back to my slide here about the kinds of students that I want to produce, risk-taking. You shouldn't only do things that you're good at. You learn by trying to do things you're not particularly good at and seeing other people be really good at it. So there's almost this tendency to kind of find your strengths and just hone those. We're human beings. We have strengths and weaknesses, and we learn by encountering both of them. Now, I'm not sure if I've entirely answered your question, but there's certainly no disdain for the use of talent and for credentials and for achievement. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's the same thing as a vocation, because it has to also become about you developing your internal capacities as a person and your vital energies and constantly keeping alive desire. One thing, and this gets back, I think, to an initial question about the burnout culture. So many students have simply lost desire. You can be very talented at something and not have desire anymore. And then your talent is not going to be well used. So I think you need to stimulate both talent and really, really stimulate students' desire.
Thank you. I'm not a plant. I have no idea.
I know.
Well, let us thank Dr. Mooney for a talk.